"You're being ridiculous, Lillian. It's just another business trip," Bradley said, barely glancing up from his laptop screen as he packed his expensive leather briefcase. The dismissive tone in his voice made my stomach clench, but I forced myself to smile anyway. "My name is Lillian, and I'm 35 years old, living what most people would consider a comfortable life in Phoenix, Arizona. My husband Bradley works as a regional sales director for Nexora Labs, a pharmaceutical consulting company, while I manage our household and work part-time as a freelance graphic designer. For 8 years, we'd built what I thought was a solid marriage based on trust, shared goals, and mutual respect. Bradley traveled frequently for work, sometimes staying away for 3 or 4 days at a time, visiting clients across the Southwest. I never questioned it because his job provided us with a beautiful home in Scottsdale, 2 luxury cars, and enough financial security that I could pursue my creative passions without the pressure of a full-time corporate position. But lately, something felt different. Bradley had become more secretive about his phone, more dismissive when I asked about his trips, and strangely defensive whenever I mentioned wanting to visit him during one of his work conferences. When I suggested joining him for his upcoming Palm Springs conference, thinking it could be like a mini vacation for us, his reaction was immediate and harsh. "Absolutely not," he'd snapped. "This isn't a vacation, Lillian. I'll be in meetings from morning until night. You'd just be sitting alone in a hotel room, bored out of your mind." His words stung more than they should have. We used to travel together all the time when we were first married. He'd encourage me to come along on his shorter business trips, and we'd make little adventures out of them. Now, the idea seemed to genuinely irritate him. "I wouldn't mind," I'd said softly. "I could work on my designs, maybe explore the area while you're busy. We haven't had any time together lately." "The company doesn't pay for spouses," he'd replied curtly, shoving another shirt into his suitcase. "And frankly, I need to focus on work, not worry about entertaining you." The conversation had ended there, but the dismissal lingered in my chest like a bruise. When had I become such a burden to him? When had my presence shifted from welcome to unwelcome? Now, watching him pack for yet another 3-day trip to Palm Springs, I felt that familiar knot of unease tightening in my stomach. He moved with practiced efficiency, folding his best suits, packing his cologne, even including the expensive watch I'd given him for his last birthday. For a work conference, he seemed awfully concerned about his appearance. "Which hotel did you say you'd be staying at again?" I asked casually, pretending to organize some papers on my desk. "The same one as always," he replied without looking at me. "The Desert Palms Resort. You know, the one where the pharmaceutical conferences are usually held." I nodded, though something about his tone felt rehearsed. "And you'll be back Friday evening?" "Late Friday night, probably. Don't wait up." He zipped his suitcase closed with more force than necessary. "I really need this trip to go smoothly, Lillian. The company has been making some changes, and I need to prove my value to the regional clients." The way he emphasized need made me look up at him more carefully. Bradley was successful at his job, consistently one of the top performers in his division. What changes was he talking about? And why hadn't he mentioned them before? "Is everything okay at work?" I asked. "You seem more stressed about this trip than usual." For just a moment, something flickered across his face. Anxiety? Guilt? But it disappeared so quickly I might have imagined it. "Everything's fine. Just the usual corporate pressures. Nothing for you to worry about. Nothing for me to worry about." That phrase had become his standard response to any question about his work, his trips, or frankly, most aspects of our life together. When had he started treating me like a child who couldn't handle adult concerns? After he left for the airport that Thursday morning, I found myself wandering through our house, feeling strangely unsettled. The silence felt heavier than usual, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Bradley's behavior had been off for months now, but I'd attributed it to work stress, maybe a midlife adjustment period. But watching him pack with such careful attention to his appearance, seeing the way he'd avoided my eyes when I asked about the hotel, I felt a creeping suspicion I didn't want to acknowledge. I tried to focus on my design work, a logo project for a small restaurant chain, but my concentration kept drifting. Finally, I gave up and decided to do something I'd never done before. I opened my laptop and looked up the Desert Palms Resort in Palm Springs. The website showed a beautiful, upscale property with pristine pools, manicured gardens, and elegant conference facilities. It looked exactly like the kind of place where pharmaceutical companies would hold their regional meetings. But as I scrolled through the photos, something nagged at me. I couldn't put my finger on what it was, but something felt off. Maybe it was the way Bradley had packed his best clothes, or how he'd been so adamant about me not coming along, or the defensive way he'd answered my simple questions. Maybe it was the accumulation of months of feeling like a stranger in my own marriage. Whatever it was, I found myself doing something I'd never done before. I started planning a surprise visit. The idea of surprising Bradley at his hotel felt both thrilling and terrifying. In 8 years of marriage, I'd never shown up unannounced during one of his business trips. I'd always respected his workspace, trusted his need for professional focus, and believed in giving him the independence he seemed to crave. But something had shifted in me over the past few months. A growing sense that the man I'd married was becoming a stranger, and I needed to understand why. Friday morning, I found myself standing in front of my closet, trying to decide what to wear for the 3-hour drive to Palm Springs. I settled on a casual but flattering sundress, something that would transition well from travel to dinner, assuming Bradley would be free to spend the evening with me. My hands shook slightly as I packed an overnight bag, and I had to keep reminding myself that this was my husband, that showing up to surprise him shouldn't feel like such a risk. The drive through the Arizona desert gave me too much time to think. I kept rehearsing what I'd say when I found him, imagining his surprise smile, the way he'd probably laugh and shake his head at my spontaneity. "You're crazy," he'd say, but in the fond way he used to when we were first dating. We'd have dinner together, maybe spend some time by the pool, and I'd remember why I'd fallen in love with him in the first place. But another part of my mind, a part I tried to silence, kept whispering darker possibilities. What if he wasn't alone? What if there was a reason he'd been so insistent that I not come? What if the growing distance between us wasn't just about work stress? I pushed those thoughts away and focused on the road ahead, the desert landscape shifting from scrubby brown to the green oasis of Palm Springs. The Desert Palms Resort was easy to find, a sprawling complex of low buildings surrounded by palm trees and desert flowers. The parking lot was full, which made sense for a conference weekend, and I felt some of my anxiety ease. This was exactly what Bradley had described, a professional event in a business-appropriate setting. At the front desk, a cheerful woman in her 20s smiled at me. "How can I help you?" "I'm looking for my husband," I said, trying to sound casual. "Bradley Morrison. He's here for the pharmaceutical conference." The woman typed something into her computer, then frowned slightly. "I'm sorry, but we don't have any pharmaceutical conferences scheduled this weekend." My heart skipped a beat. "Are you sure? He said he was staying here for a Nexera Labs conference." She checked again, then shook her head. "No corporate events at all this weekend. We do have a guest registered under that name, though. Room 237. The blood rushed in my ears as I tried to process what she'd just told me. No conference, no business event, just Bradley, staying at an expensive resort hotel, apparently for reasons he'd lied to me about. "Could you please call his room?" I managed to ask. "I'd like to surprise him." "Of course." She dialed the extension and waited. After a few rings, she hung up. "No answer, I'm afraid. Would you like to leave a message?" "No, that's fine. I'll just go up and wait for him." I managed what I hoped was a normal smile. We were supposed to meet for dinner anyway. The elevator ride to the second floor felt endless. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Maybe there had been a misunderstanding about the conference. Maybe it had been moved or canceled. Maybe Bradley had decided to take a personal day and hadn't wanted to worry me. But even as I tried to rationalize what I'd learned at the front desk, I knew something was very wrong. Room 237 was at the end of the hallway, and I stood outside the door for several minutes, my hand raised to knock but unable to follow through. Part of me wanted to turn around, drive home, and pretend this had never happened. But I'd come too far to back down now. I knocked softly. No answer. I knocked again, a little louder. Still nothing. Finally, I tried the door handle, not really expecting it to turn. It did. The door swung open to reveal a hotel room that was clearly occupied. Bradley's suitcase was open on the luggage rack, his clothes scattered around the room with an unusual carelessness that didn't match his normally meticulous habits. The bed was unmade, and I could smell expensive perfume in the air, something floral and heavy that definitely wasn't mine. My legs felt weak as I stepped into the room, looking around with growing disbelief. On the nightstand, I spotted something that made my blood run cold. A room service receipt, crumpled but still readable. The timestamp showed it was from the night before, Thursday evening. The order was for 3 dinners, 3 bottles of wine, and chocolate-covered strawberries. Dinner for 3. As I stood there holding the receipt, my hands trembling, I heard it. The sound of running water from the bathroom, and voices. Multiple voices. Female voices, laughing and chatting in a way that was clearly intimate and comfortable. The shower was running, and Bradley wasn't alone. I felt like the floor was tilting beneath me. 8 years of marriage, 8 years of trust and shared dreams and plans for the future, and I was standing in a hotel room listening to my husband shower with women I didn't know. Women he'd apparently had dinner with the night before. Women he was clearly very familiar with, based on the casual tone of their conversation. I should have left. I should have walked out of that room, driven home, and confronted him when he returned. But I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, holding that damning receipt, listening to my marriage dissolve in real time. The water shut off, and the voices grew clearer. I heard Bradley's laugh, followed by a woman saying something about next time, and the usual arrangement. That's when I realized I had 2 choices. I could run, or I could finally learn the truth about what my husband had been doing during all those business trips. I chose the truth. I moved quickly but quietly to the closet near the bathroom, positioning myself behind the partially open door where I could see without being seen. My heart hammered so loudly I was certain everyone in the room would hear it, but I forced myself to stay calm and focused. Whatever was about to happen, I needed to see it clearly, to understand exactly what I was dealing with. The bathroom door opened, and Bradley emerged first, wearing one of the hotel's thick white robes. He looked relaxed and satisfied in a way I hadn't seen from him in months. Behind him came 2 women, both probably in their mid-20s, both strikingly beautiful, both wearing matching hotel robes that barely covered their thighs. They moved with a casual familiarity that spoke of routine, of an arrangement that had clearly happened many times before. "Same time next month?" asked the brunette, a statuesque woman with professionally styled hair and expertly applied makeup that had somehow survived the shower. Her voice carried a slight accent I couldn't place, and she spoke with the businesslike tone of someone discussing a regular appointment. "Absolutely," Bradley replied, pulling out his wallet. "The 15th through 17th, just like always." The blonde, shorter but equally polished, laughed. "You know, Bradley, most of our regulars don't book us for entire weekends. You must really love your business trips." Bradley chuckled, counting out what looked like several $100 bills. "What can I say? I believe in work-life balance." I pressed my hand against my mouth to keep from making any sound. Regulars. This wasn't a one-time mistake or a moment of weakness. This was a pattern, a routine that had been going on for months, maybe years. "Your wife still doesn't suspect anything?" asked the brunette, accepting the money Bradley handed her. "Lillian?" Bradley's voice carried a dismissive tone that made my skin crawl. She's completely clueless, too busy with her little art projects to pay attention to anything important. As long as I tell her it's business, she believes whatever I say. The blonde started getting dressed, pulling on expensive-looking lingerie that definitely hadn't come from any department store. That must be nice, having someone so trusting. It has its advantages, Bradley agreed. She handles all the domestic stuff, keeps the house running, never asks too many questions about my expenses. Perfect setup, really. I felt physically sick. The casual way he dismissed me, reduced 8 years of marriage to convenient domestic services, made me want to storm out of the closet and confront all of them. But something held me back. Maybe it was shock. Maybe it was a survival instinct telling me I needed more information before I acted. Speaking of expenses, the brunette said, now dressed in a designer dress that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in 6 months. You're still running everything through your company, right? Same credit cards? Bradley nodded. Corporate card for all entertainment expenses. My company has very generous policies about client relations. My blood turned to ice. He was using his company credit cards for this. Not only was my husband cheating on me with prostitutes, but he was committing fraud to pay for it. The implications hit me like a truck. If he was charging these expenses to Nexora Labs, he was stealing from his employer, and as his spouse, I could potentially be held liable for tax fraud on our joint returns. How long have you been doing this? The blonde asked, checking her appearance in the dresser mirror. About 3 years now, Bradley replied casually. Started with just local arrangements, but the out-of-town trips are so much better. More discreet, and the company pays for the hotel anyway. 3 years. He'd been systematically lying to me, cheating on me, and committing corporate fraud for 3 years. Every business trip, every conference, every time he'd brushed off my questions or insisted I couldn't come along, he'd been protecting this elaborate deception. Well, it's been lovely as always, the brunette said, gathering her purse. Same girls next month, or do you want to try someone new? You two are perfect, Bradley assured them. Why change what works? They exchanged air kisses like old friends, and I watched in horror as my husband casually discussed his next appointment with these women as if he were scheduling a business meeting. The casual nature of it all, the routine familiarity, the complete absence of guilt or shame in his demeanor, told me everything I needed to know about who Bradley really was. After the women left, Bradley moved around the room with practiced efficiency, gathering the scattered clothes, straightening the bed, and opening the windows to air out the perfume smell. He was obviously experienced at covering his tracks, at eliminating evidence of what had happened here. How many times had he done this exact routine? How many lies had he told me over the years? I remained hidden in the closet, barely breathing, as I watched him prepare to return to his normal life, to come home to me with stories about boring conferences and difficult clients. The man I'd thought I knew, the man I'd built a life with, was a complete stranger. Worse than a stranger, he was a criminal who had been using our marriage as cover for his illegal activities. But as I watched him methodically erase the evidence of his betrayal, something shifted inside me. The initial shock and devastation began to crystallize into something else entirely. Cold, calculating anger. Bradley thought I was clueless, too trusting, too naive to figure out what he was really doing. He thought he could continue this charade indefinitely, stealing from his company, lying to me, and treating our marriage like a convenient facade. He was about to learn how wrong he was. I waited until he went into the bathroom to shower again. Then I quietly slipped out of the closet and began taking photos with my phone. The rumpled bed, the room service receipt still lying on the nightstand, the champagne glasses still sitting on the dresser. I photographed everything, making sure to capture the room number, the timestamp on the receipt, any evidence that would prove what had happened here. Then I slipped out of the room and headed for the elevator, my mind already working on my next steps. Bradley had made a crucial mistake when he assumed I was too stupid to figure out his game. But I wasn't the naive woman he thought he'd married. I was about to become his worst nightmare. The real question wasn't whether I was going to expose him. The question was how much damage I was going to do on my way out. I drove home from Palm Springs in a strange state of focused calm that surprised me. The 3-hour journey gave me time to process what I'd witnessed and begin formulating a plan. By the time I pulled into our driveway in Scottsdale, I knew exactly what I needed to do, and the first step was gathering evidence. Bradley wouldn't be home until late that night, which gave me several hours to search through our financial records without interruption. I'd never paid much attention to the details of our joint accounts or his business expenses, trusting him to handle the financial side of our marriage, while I focused on my design work and managing our household. That trust, I now realized, had been a massive mistake. I started with our home office, a room I rarely entered since Bradley had claimed it as his private workspace years ago. His desk was meticulously organized, with neat stacks of business papers and expense reports filed in labeled folders. As I began going through the documents, a pattern quickly emerged that made my stomach churn. The corporate credit card statements told a story I'd never imagined. Monthly charges at high-end hotels in cities across the Southwest, always for extended stays that coincided with Bradley's business trips. Restaurant bills for expensive dinners that were always charged for multiple people, sometimes as many as 4 or 5 guests. Charges at luxury spas, expensive boutiques, even jewelry stores, all categorized as client entertainment or business development expenses. But it was the consulting service charges that made the picture crystal clear. Monthly payments ranging from $2,000 to $5,000 to companies with names like Executive Wellness Solutions, Premier Client Services, and Sunshine Hospitality Consultants. The amounts were staggering, and when I added them up over the past 3 years, the total came to over $85,000 in fraudulent expenses. My hands were shaking as I photographed each document with my phone, creating a comprehensive record of Bradley's systematic theft from his employer. This wasn't just adultery. This was felony embezzlement on a massive scale. And because we filed joint tax returns, I could potentially be held liable as an accomplice if the authorities decided I should have known about the fraud. I moved to Bradley's computer next, surprised to find it wasn't password protected. His overconfidence in my supposed ignorance had made him careless about security. His email revealed even more damning evidence: correspondence with escort agencies, detailed arrangements for his monthly business trips, and casual discussions about services and prices that read like ordering from a catalog. One email chain particularly caught my attention. It was from 6 months ago, between Bradley and someone named Jasmine, who appeared to be a booking coordinator for one of the escort services. Bradley had been complaining about having to be more creative with his expense categorizations because his company had started requiring more detailed justifications for entertainment expenses. "Don't worry about it," Jasmine had replied. "We can provide you with detailed consulting invoices that will pass any audit. Our clients in corporate positions need discretion, and we're very good at providing the right paperwork." The escort service was actively helping him commit fraud, providing fake invoices and consultation agreements that would allow him to steal from his employer while covering his tracks. This wasn't just personal betrayal. This was organized criminal activity that had been going on right under my nose for years. As I continued searching through his files, I found something that made my blood run cold. A detailed budget spreadsheet that showed exactly how much money Bradley was stealing each month and how he was using it. The amounts weren't just for the escort services themselves. He was padding his expense reports with fake meals, fictional client gifts, and inflated hotel charges, skimming thousands of extra dollars each month that went into a separate bank account I'd never known existed. The secret account statements showed a balance of over $40,000. Money he'd been systematically stealing from Nexora Labs and hiding from me. But what really shocked me was how he'd been using this slush fund. Beyond the escort services, he'd been making payments to a gambling website, buying expensive electronics that I'd never seen, and even making regular transfers to what appeared to be another woman's account, someone named Veronica who lived in Las Vegas. I sat back in his desk chair, overwhelmed by the scope of his deception. This wasn't just about cheating or even corporate fraud. Bradley had been living an entirely separate life, funded by stolen money, while using our marriage as a convenient cover story. I was nothing more than a prop in his elaborate criminal enterprise, the naive wife whose presence made him appear stable and trustworthy to his employers and colleagues. But as devastating as these discoveries were, they also gave me something powerful: leverage. Bradley had no idea that I knew about any of this. He thought he was coming home to the same oblivious wife who would smile and ask about his business conference, who would believe whatever lies he told about his successful meetings with clients. I spent the rest of the afternoon making copies of everything, uploading documents to a secure cloud storage account, and organizing the evidence into categories: corporate fraud, tax evasion, and personal betrayal. By the time I heard Bradley's car in the driveway at nearly midnight, I had built a comprehensive case against him that would destroy both his career and his freedom. The hardest part was acting normal when he walked through the door. He looked tired but satisfied, carrying himself with the same casual confidence he always displayed after his business trips. He kissed my forehead absently, the same perfunctory gesture he'd been giving me for months, and asked about my weekend in the same disinterested tone he always used. "How was the conference?" I asked, amazed at how steady my voice sounded. "Productive," he replied, loosening his tie. "Closed 2 major deals and made some good connections for future business. The company should be very happy with the results." The casual way he lied to my face after everything I'd discovered made me want to confront him immediately. But I forced myself to smile and nod, to play the role of the trusting wife for just a little longer. I needed more than evidence. I needed a strategy that would protect me legally while ensuring that Bradley faced the full consequences of his actions. "That's wonderful," I managed to say. "I'm proud of you for working so hard." He barely acknowledged the compliment, already heading upstairs to shower off the evidence of his weekend activities. As I listened to the water running, I realized that the man I'd married had been gone for years, replaced by a stranger who saw me as nothing more than a useful fool. But that stranger had made a crucial error in judgment. He'd underestimated exactly how smart and determined his clueless wife could be when she finally understood what she was dealing with. The next few weeks were the most challenging acting job of my life. Every morning, I had to wake up beside a man who disgusted me, smile at his casual lies about his work, and pretend to be the same naive woman he thought he'd married. But while Bradley went about his routine, assuming nothing had changed, I was systematically building a case that would ensure his complete destruction. I started by consulting with a divorce attorney, someone I found through careful research who specialized in cases involving financial fraud. Catherine Brennan had a reputation for being ruthless in protecting her clients' interests, and when I showed her the evidence I'd gathered, her eyes lit up with professional satisfaction. "This is one of the most comprehensive fraud cases I've seen," she told me during our confidential consultation. "Your husband isn't just cheating. He's committed multiple felonies that could result in serious prison time." "What does that mean for me?" I asked, voicing the fear that had been keeping me awake at night. "We filed joint tax returns. Could I be charged as an accomplice?" Catherine shook her head. "Not if we handle this correctly. The key is to report the fraud before the authorities discover it on their own. If you cooperate fully and demonstrate that you were genuinely unaware of his criminal activities, you'll be protected." She outlined a strategy that was both brilliant and brutal. First, we would document everything, creating a timeline of Bradley's fraudulent activities that would be impossible for him to deny. Then, we would simultaneously file for divorce and report his crimes to both his employer and the relevant law enforcement agencies. The timing would be crucial. Bradley needed to be completely blindsided so he couldn't destroy evidence or flee. "The goal is to leave him with no options and no allies," Catherine explained. "By the time he realizes what's happening, his career will be over, criminal charges will be pending, and his assets will be frozen." While working with Catherine, I also began implementing my own investigation. I hired a private investigator named David Cross, a former federal agent who specialized in corporate fraud cases. David's job was to verify everything I'd discovered and to uncover any additional criminal activities I might have missed. What David found exceeded even my worst expectations. Bradley's fraud wasn't limited to escort services. He'd been running multiple schemes simultaneously. He'd been claiming fake travel expenses for trips he never took, submitting receipts for fictional client meals, and even billing the company for personal purchases by categorizing them as office supplies or promotional materials. "Your husband has stolen well over $100,000 from his employer," David reported during one of our meetings. "He's been doing this so long and so systematically that he's gotten careless. There are digital footprints everywhere." But David's most shocking discovery came when he traced some of the gambling and entertainment expenses in Bradley's secret accounts. It turned out that Veronica, the woman in Las Vegas who'd been receiving regular payments, wasn't just another girlfriend. She was Bradley's business partner in a side venture that involved selling confidential client information from Nexora Labs to competing pharmaceutical companies. "Industrial espionage," David explained grimly. "Your husband has been selling his employer's trade secrets to their competitors. This isn't just fraud anymore, it's corporate espionage that could result in federal charges." The scope of Bradley's criminal activities was breathtaking. He'd been using his position at Nexora Labs to steal money, sell confidential information, and maintain multiple relationships while using our marriage as cover. I wasn't just dealing with an unfaithful husband. I was married to a career criminal who had been operating right under everyone's nose. As the evidence mounted, I found myself changing in ways I hadn't expected. The devastated, betrayed wife was gradually replaced by someone harder, more calculating, more determined to see justice done. Bradley had spent years underestimating me, treating me like a decorative accessory to his real life. Now, I was going to show him exactly how wrong he'd been about my capabilities. The turning point came 3 weeks after my discovery in Palm Springs. Bradley announced another business trip, this time to Las Vegas for what he claimed was a regional pharmaceutical convention. But thanks to David's investigation, I knew exactly what this trip really was. A meeting with Veronica to finalize another sale of confidential client data. "How long will you be gone?" I asked, maintaining the same disinterested tone I'd perfected over the past month. "Just 2 nights," Bradley replied, not bothering to look up from his phone. "Should be back Wednesday evening." Wednesday evening. That gave me exactly 48 hours to execute the plan Catherine and I had been developing. While Bradley was in Las Vegas committing fresh crimes with his accomplices, I would be systematically dismantling his entire life. The night before he left, I watched him pack with the same careful attention to appearance that had first aroused my suspicions. But now I knew exactly why he took such care with his clothes and grooming. He wasn't just meeting clients. He was maintaining relationships with criminal partners and escort services, all of whom expected him to look the part of a successful pharmaceutical executive. "Be safe," I told him as he loaded his suitcase into his car Tuesday morning, and I meant it in a way he couldn't possibly understand. I wanted him safe until I could destroy him properly. As soon as his car disappeared around the corner, I put our plan into motion. Catherine had already prepared all the legal documents we would need: divorce papers citing adultery and fraud, court orders to freeze Bradley's accounts, and detailed reports to submit to law enforcement. David had organized all his investigative findings into a comprehensive package that would make prosecution inevitable. My first call was to Nexora Labs' corporate security department. I'd researched the company thoroughly and knew they took fraud very seriously, especially when it involved the theft of client information. The security director, a woman named Patricia Valdez, agreed to meet with me that afternoon after I explained that I had evidence of systematic embezzlement by one of their regional directors. The meeting was surreal. I sat in a sterile corporate conference room, surrounded by executives and security personnel, while I methodically destroyed my husband's career with documents and recordings I'd gathered from his own office. Patricia and her team listened in growing amazement as I laid out the full scope of Bradley's criminal activities. "This is one of the most comprehensive fraud cases we've ever seen," Patricia said, echoing Catherine's earlier assessment. "We'll need to involve federal authorities immediately, especially given the industrial espionage component." By Tuesday evening, the trap was set. Federal agents were preparing warrants. Nexora Labs was freezing Bradley's corporate accounts, and Catherine had filed papers that would freeze our joint assets to prevent him from hiding stolen money. Bradley had no idea that his entire world was about to collapse, that his carefully constructed criminal enterprise was unraveling while he celebrated with his accomplices in Las Vegas. Wednesday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of a perfect Arizona day, and I felt more focused and determined than I had in years. While Bradley was undoubtedly enjoying what he thought was another successful criminal venture in Las Vegas, completely unaware that his world was about to implode, I was putting the finishing touches on his destruction. The federal agents arrived at our house at exactly 9 a.m., armed with search warrants and accompanied by investigators from Nexora Labs' security team. Leading the group was Agent Sarah Chen, a specialist in white-collar crime who had reviewed all the evidence I'd provided and deemed it sufficient for multiple felony charges. "Mrs. Morrison," Agent Chen said, as I let them into our home, "we want to thank you for your cooperation in this investigation. Your evidence has been invaluable in building our case against your husband." Watching federal agents systematically search through Bradley's office, seizing computers, documents, and financial records, felt like vindication for all the years I'd been dismissed and taken for granted. Every file folder they bagged as evidence, every hard drive they confiscated, represented another nail in the coffin of Bradley's arrogance. David Cross arrived shortly after the agents, carrying additional evidence he'd gathered during his surveillance of Bradley's Las Vegas activities. His report confirmed what we'd suspected. Bradley was indeed meeting with Veronica and had sold another batch of confidential client information to a competing pharmaceutical company. "We have photographs of the meeting, recordings of their conversations, and documentation of the payment," David informed Agent Chen. "Your husband received $50,000 for the latest batch of stolen data." $50,000. As I listened to David's report, I realized that Bradley had been making more money from his criminal activities than from his legitimate salary. Our entire lifestyle, everything I'd thought was the result of his professional success, had been built on theft and fraud. Catherine arrived at noon with the final legal documents, including a comprehensive divorce filing that would ensure I received maximum protection from Bradley's criminal liabilities, while securing my fair share of any legitimate assets we'd acquired during our marriage. "The timing is perfect," she told me as we reviewed the papers. "By filing simultaneously with the criminal investigation, we're demonstrating your complete cooperation with authorities while protecting your legal interests." But the most satisfying moment came when Patricia Valdez from Nexora Labs called to inform me that Bradley's corporate credit cards had been suspended and his access to company systems had been terminated. "We've also discovered that your husband was scheduled for a performance review next week, where he was going to be promoted to Senior Regional Director," Patricia said. The promotion would have given him access to even more confidential information and increased his expense account limits. The irony was perfect. Bradley had been on the verge of the biggest promotion of his career, a position that would have allowed him to steal even more money and sensitive information. But his arrogance and overconfidence had led him to destroy it all instead. As the day progressed, I found myself in the strange position of feeling genuinely excited for the first time in months. For years, I'd felt like I was slowly disappearing in my own marriage, becoming smaller and less significant as Bradley's dismissive treatment eroded my self-worth. But now, as I watched his carefully constructed criminal empire crumble through my actions, I felt powerful and vindicated. The call I'd been waiting for came at 4 p.m. Bradley's voice on the other end of the line sounded confused and slightly panicked, a tone I'd never heard from him before. "Lillian, something's wrong with my corporate cards," he said without preamble. "They're all being declined, and I can't access my company email." I took a deep breath, savoring the moment I'd been planning for weeks. "That's probably because Nexora Labs has suspended your accounts pending a fraud investigation." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long, I thought the call had disconnected. When Bradley finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What are you talking about?" I'm talking about the $85,000 you've stolen from your employer over the past 3 years, I said calmly. I'm talking about the escort services you've been billing as business expenses. I'm talking about the confidential information you've been selling to competing companies. Should I continue? Another long silence. When Bradley spoke again, his voice had shifted from confusion to anger. You don't know what you're talking about, he said, but the bluster in his tone couldn't hide his fear. You don't understand how business works. I understand enough to know that you're a criminal, I replied evenly. I also understand that federal agents are currently searching our house, that your employer has fired you, and that you're facing multiple felony charges that could send you to prison for decades. I heard Bradley's sharp intake of breath, followed by what sounded like him dropping his phone. When he came back on the line, his voice was pleading in a way I'd never heard before. Lillian, we need to talk. There are things you don't understand, explanations I can give you. Come to Las Vegas, and we can work this out together. I've already worked it out, I told him. I've filed for divorce, I've reported your crimes to the authorities, and I've protected myself from your criminal liabilities. There's nothing left to discuss. You can't do this to me. Bradley's voice cracked with desperation. I'm your husband. Everything I did was for us, for our future. Everything you did was theft, I corrected him, and adultery, and fraud, and industrial espionage. You did it all for yourself, while treating me like a convenient fool who would provide cover for your crimes. I could hear him crying now, the first real emotion I'd heard from him in years. But it wasn't remorse for what he'd done to me or to his employer. It was self-pity because his criminal schemes had finally caught up with him. The federal agents want to speak with you, I continued. I suggest you get a good criminal defense attorney and turn yourself in before they issue a warrant for your arrest. Lillian, please, he begged. I love you. I made mistakes, but we can fix this together. You don't love me, I said with absolute certainty. You love having a wife who is too trusting to question your lies. But that woman is gone, Bradley. She died in a hotel room in Palm Springs when she discovered what kind of man she'd really married. I hung up the phone and immediately blocked his number, cutting off his last connection to the life he'd been systematically destroying for years. Outside, I could see Agent Chen and her team loading evidence boxes into their vehicles, preparing to build the case that would put my husband in federal prison. Catherine had warned me that the next few months would be difficult, that criminal proceedings and divorce cases involving fraud were complicated and emotionally draining. But as I stood in our house, watching the last of Bradley's lies being carted away as evidence, I felt nothing but relief and anticipation. For the first time in years, I was free to discover who I really was, when I wasn't trying to be the perfect wife to a man who saw me as nothing more than a useful fool. The next morning brought news that exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. Agent Chen called at 8 a.m. to inform me that Bradley had been arrested at his Las Vegas hotel while attempting to flee the country with Veronica and nearly $200,000 in cash. Your husband was apparently planning to disappear to a non-extradition country, Agent Chen explained. But thanks to your cooperation, we were able to track his movements and arrest him before he could leave Nevada. He's being held without bail on multiple federal charges. The image of Bradley in handcuffs, his carefully constructed facade finally stripped away, filled me with a satisfaction I hadn't expected to feel. For years, he'd treated me like I was too stupid to understand his sophisticated business dealings, too naive to recognize when I was being manipulated and lied to. Now, he was learning exactly how wrong he'd been about my intelligence. Catherine called an hour later with equally satisfying news about the civil proceedings. The court has frozen all of Bradley's assets, including the secret accounts he thought you didn't know about. We've also secured a judgment that protects you from any liability related to his criminal activities. But perhaps the most gratifying call came from Patricia Valdez at Nexora Labs. The company's internal investigation had revealed that Bradley's fraud was even more extensive than we'd initially discovered. We found evidence that your husband had been stealing from the company for over 5 years, not 3, Patricia told me. The total amount approaches $300,000 when you include the industrial espionage payments. He single-handedly caused more financial damage to this company than any employee in our history. The scope of Bradley's criminality was staggering, but it also meant that my decision to expose him had saved Nexora Labs from potentially millions in additional losses. The company's executives were so grateful for my cooperation that they'd agreed to provide a substantial reward for information leading to Bradley's prosecution. $25,000, Patricia explained. It's not much compared to what he stole, but the board wanted to recognize that your actions prevented far greater losses. As I processed all this information, I realized that Bradley's downfall was more complete than I dared to hope. His criminal career was over, his freedom was gone, his reputation was destroyed, and his carefully hoarded stolen money was being returned to his victims. Meanwhile, I was not only protected from legal consequences, but actually being rewarded for my role in stopping his crimes. The irony was perfect. Bradley had spent years dismissing my intelligence while using our marriage to legitimize his criminal activities. Now, that same intelligence he'd underestimated had destroyed him completely, while setting me free to rebuild my life on my own terms. But the personal satisfaction paled in comparison to what happened when news of Bradley's arrest reached our social circle. Within hours of the story breaking in the local business press, my phone was ringing constantly with calls from friends, neighbors, and colleagues who were shocked to learn about my husband's double life. "Lillian, I can't believe it," said Janet, one of our neighbors who had always seemed slightly envious of our lifestyle. "Bradley always seemed so successful, so stable. How did you not know what he was doing?" The question stung because it implied that I should have known, that a good wife would have been more suspicious of her husband's activities. But I'd learned enough about manipulation and abuse during my consultations with Catherine to recognize the victim-blaming inherent in such questions. "Bradley was very skilled at deception," I replied calmly. "He spent years building an elaborate facade specifically designed to hide his criminal activities. I trusted him because that's what spouses do in healthy marriages." What surprised me was how many people emerged with their own suspicions about Bradley that they'd never shared with me. My friend Carol admitted that she'd always thought it was strange how often Bradley traveled for work. My graphic design colleague Marcus mentioned that he'd wondered how we could afford our lifestyle on Bradley's stated salary. Even my hairstylist revealed that she'd found Bradley's behavior inappropriate during my appointments, the way he'd dismiss my opinions and talk about me like I wasn't there. "We all notice things," Carol said during one of our conversations. "But nobody wanted to say anything because you seemed happy, and it wasn't our place to interfere in your marriage." The revelation that multiple people in my life had harbored doubts about Bradley but stayed silent was both validating and frustrating. It confirmed that his behavior had been obviously problematic to outside observers, but it also showed how isolation works in abusive relationships. Bradley had successfully created an environment where I doubted my own perceptions, while others who might have supported me stayed quiet out of politeness. But those same people were now eager to offer support and admiration for my role in exposing Bradley's crimes. The woman who had been dismissed as naive and clueless was suddenly being praised for her intelligence and courage in bringing down a sophisticated criminal operation. "You're amazing," said my former college roommate Sarah when she called after seeing the news. "I always knew you were smart, but taking down your own husband's criminal empire? That takes serious guts." The praise felt good, but what felt even better was the growing realization that I was free to become whoever I wanted to be, without Bradley's constant dismissive presence in my life. For years, I'd shrunk myself to fit his image of the perfect, supportive wife, sublimating my own ambitions and interests to maintain his comfort. Now, with that pressure gone, I was rediscovering parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. I started with small changes. I rearranged our house to reflect my tastes rather than Bradley's, removing the expensive art he'd chosen and replacing it with pieces that actually spoke to me. I cleared out his office and converted it into a proper design studio where I could work on expanding my freelance business. I even bought myself new clothes that I liked rather than ones Bradley would approve of. Each change felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that I'd lost during our marriage. 2 months after Bradley's arrest, I received an unexpected phone call that would lead to one of the most satisfying moments of my entire revenge. The caller was investigative journalist Rebecca Torres from the Phoenix Business Journal, who was working on a comprehensive exposé about corporate fraud in Arizona's pharmaceutical industry. "Mrs. Morrison, I've been following your husband's case, and I'd like to interview you about your role in exposing his crimes," Rebecca explained. "Your story is remarkable, and I think it could help other people recognize similar warning signs in their own relationships." The idea of publicly telling my story was both terrifying and appealing. Part of me wanted to maintain privacy and simply move forward with my life. But another part, the part that had been dismissed and underestimated for years, wanted the world to know exactly how I'd brought down Bradley's criminal empire. "What would you want to know?" I asked. "Everything," Rebecca replied. "How you discovered his crimes, how you gathered evidence, how you worked with law enforcement to build the case. But most importantly, I want to tell the story of how a woman everyone underestimated became the architect of one of the most comprehensive fraud prosecutions in state history." The interview took place the following week in Rebecca's downtown Phoenix office. For 3 hours, I recounted every detail of my journey from suspicious wife to criminal prosecutor, explaining how I'd uncovered Bradley's elaborate deception and methodically built the case that destroyed him. Rebecca was particularly interested in the psychological aspects of the story, how Bradley had used manipulation and gaslighting to maintain his criminal activities, while keeping me compliant and unsuspecting. "Your husband created a classic pattern of financial abuse," Rebecca observed. "He controlled information, dismissed your intelligence, and used your trust against you. But when you finally saw through his manipulation, you turned those same tactics against him." The article, titled "The Wife Who Brought Down a Criminal Empire: How One Woman's Intelligence Destroyed Her Husband's $300,000 Fraud Scheme," was published 2 weeks later as the cover story of the Business Journal's monthly magazine. Rebecca had done an incredible job of presenting my story as both a cautionary tale about financial abuse and an inspiring example of how victims can take back control. But what made the article truly special was how it portrayed me not as a victim who got lucky, but as an intelligent, determined woman who had systematically outmaneuvered a career criminal. The article detailed my investigative work, my collaboration with law enforcement, and my strategic decision-making in a way that highlighted my capabilities rather than my victimization. Morrison's methodical approach to gathering evidence and building her case demonstrates a level of strategic thinking that would be impressive in a professional investigator, Rebecca wrote. Her husband spent years assuming she was too naive to recognize his criminal activities, but Morrison proved that intelligence and determination can be far more dangerous to a criminal than suspicion alone. The response to the article was overwhelming. I received dozens of calls and emails from readers who wanted to share their own stories of financial abuse or express their admiration for my actions. Several law enforcement agencies reached out to ask if I'd be willing to speak at training seminars about recognizing financial fraud. Even a literary agent contacted me about potentially writing a book about my experience. But the most satisfying response came from someone I hadn't expected to hear from, Bradley himself. 3 days after the article was published, I received a letter forwarded through Catherine from Bradley's federal detention facility. In it, he expressed his rage at my decision to go public with our story, accusing me of destroying what remained of his reputation for personal gain. "You didn't need to humiliate me publicly," he wrote. "Haven't you done enough damage to my life already? I'm facing decades in prison because of your betrayal, and now you're profiting from my destruction by giving interviews to reporters." The letter was so perfectly emblematic of Bradley's narcissistic worldview that I almost laughed while reading it. Even facing federal prison for his crimes, he still saw himself as the victim and me as the villain. He couldn't comprehend that his own actions had consequences, that his years of lies and theft and betrayal had finally caught up with him through the intelligence and determination of the wife he'd spent so long underestimating. I didn't respond to the letter, but I did share it with Rebecca, who used excerpts in a follow-up article about how financial abusers often blame their victims even after being exposed and prosecuted. Meanwhile, my own life was rapidly improving in ways I hadn't anticipated. The publicity from Rebecca's article had brought me several new high-profile design clients, including 2 pharmaceutical companies who were impressed by my role in exposing corporate fraud. My business was growing faster than it ever had during my marriage, partly because I no longer had to structure my work around Bradley's travel schedule and social obligations. I also received an unexpected job offer from Nexora Labs themselves. Patricia Valdez contacted me about a position in their corporate security department, working specifically on fraud prevention and employee education. Your investigative skills and understanding of how financial fraud operates would be invaluable to our security team, Patricia explained during our meeting. Plus, having someone with your experience help develop training programs would send a strong message about our commitment to preventing future incidents. The irony of being offered a job by the company Bradley had stolen from was too perfect to pass up. I accepted the position, which came with a substantial salary increase and excellent benefits, along with the satisfaction of knowing that I was now being paid to prevent the kind of crimes my ex-husband had committed. As I cleaned out the last of Bradley's belongings from our house, preparing to fully claim the space as my own, I found myself reflecting on how completely our situations had reversed. Bradley was sitting in a federal detention center, facing decades in prison, with his reputation destroyed and his assets seized. Meanwhile, I was starting a new career, expanding my business, and discovering capabilities I hadn't known I possessed. The woman he'd dismissed as too naive to understand sophisticated business dealings was now being paid to teach sophisticated business professionals how to recognize and prevent financial fraud. 6 months after Bradley's arrest, I found myself sitting in a federal courthouse, watching my former husband plead guilty to multiple felony charges in what prosecutors called one of the most comprehensive white-collar crime cases in Arizona history. The man who had once dismissed my intelligence and treated me like a decorative accessory was now wearing prison orange and being led away in shackles. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month, but Bradley's attorney had already informed the court that his client was facing between 15 and 25 years in federal prison. The plea agreement required him to pay full restitution to Nexora Labs and surrender all assets derived from his criminal activities, including the secret accounts he'd thought I'd never discover. Judge Patricia Whitman, who was presiding over the case, made several remarks during the hearing that filled me with vindication. Mr. Morrison's crimes were not impulsive acts, but rather a systematic pattern of theft and fraud that continued for years, she said. The defendant showed a callous disregard not only for his employer's trust, but for the welfare of his own wife, who could have faced serious legal consequences for his criminal activities. As I watched Bradley accept responsibility for his crimes, I couldn't help but remember the condescending way he used to explain why I couldn't understand his work, how he dismissed my questions about his expenses and travel as naive interference in sophisticated business matters. The man who had spent years telling me I was too simple to grasp complex financial concepts was now admitting to federal judges that he was a criminal who had defrauded his employer of hundreds of thousands of dollars. After the hearing, Agent Chen approached me in the courthouse hallway with news that provided the final piece of satisfaction I needed. Veronica, your husband's accomplice in Las Vegas, has agreed to cooperate fully with our investigation, she informed me. Her testimony revealed that Bradley had been planning to expand his operations, potentially recruiting other pharmaceutical executives to sell confidential information. Your actions didn't just stop his existing crimes, they prevented a much larger criminal conspiracy. The realization that I had prevented Bradley from corrupting other people, from turning his individual criminality into an organized conspiracy, made me feel proud in a way I hadn't expected. My decision to investigate my suspicions and methodically build a case against him had protected not just Nexora Labs, but potentially the entire pharmaceutical industry from a sophisticated espionage ring. Catherine, who had handled my divorce with the same ruthless efficiency she'd applied to protecting my legal interests, delivered the final blow to Bradley's remaining arrogance. The divorce settlement, which had been finalized the previous month, left me with the house, both cars, and most of our legitimate assets, while Bradley was left with nothing but his legal debts and restitution obligations. He tried to argue that you should share responsibility for his legal fees since you were the one who reported his crimes, Catherine told me with obvious satisfaction. The judge literally laughed at his attorney, and said that expecting a crime victim to pay for her abuser's defense was the most ridiculous request he'd heard in 20 years on the bench. But perhaps the most satisfying development was how my professional life had evolved since Bradley's downfall. My position at Nexera Labs had led to consulting opportunities with other corporations, speaking engagements at business conferences, and invitations to serve on panels about fraud prevention and corporate security. The woman Bradley had dismissed as too naive to understand business was now recognized as an expert in identifying and preventing financial crimes. Last month, I was invited to speak at the National Association of Corporate Security Professionals annual conference in Denver, where I presented a case study based on my experience with Bradley's fraud scheme. The presentation was titled, "When the Threat Comes from Within: How Personal Relationships Enable Corporate Fraud," and it was attended by over 300 security professionals from companies across the country. Standing on that stage, explaining to an audience of experts how I had methodically uncovered and documented a sophisticated fraud scheme, I felt a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with recognizing my own capabilities. Bradley had spent years convincing me that I was intellectually inferior to him, that my contributions to our marriage were limited to domestic support and emotional labor. But in bringing down his criminal enterprise, I had demonstrated investigative skills, strategic thinking, and professional competence that impressed law enforcement agents, corporate executives, and security professionals. The speaking engagement also led to an unexpected personal development. During the conference, I met David Harrison, a security consultant from Seattle who had been working on a similar case involving a pharmaceutical executive who had been stealing trade secrets. David was intelligent, ethical, and refreshingly straightforward in his communication. Everything that Bradley had pretended to be, but never actually was. Our conversations during the conference revealed that we had similar interests in fraud prevention and corporate security, but also that we both valued honesty and mutual respect in ways that my marriage had never provided. When David suggested that we stay in touch professionally, and possibly personally, I realized that I was finally ready to consider what healthy relationships might look like. 3 weeks later, David flew to Phoenix for what started as a business consultation, but evolved into something much more personal. For the first time in years, I found myself in conversation with a man who listened to my ideas, respected my expertise, and treated my intelligence as an asset rather than a threat. "You know," David said over dinner at one of my favorite restaurants, "reading about your case was what convinced me that civilian investigators can sometimes be more effective than professional ones. You had insights into your husband's behavior that no external investigator could have developed." The compliment meant more to me than David could have realized. After years of having my perceptions dismissed and my intelligence minimized, being recognized as a skilled investigator by someone whose professional opinion I respected felt like the final validation I needed. Bradley faced the inevitable consequences of his systematic betrayal and criminal behavior, spending the next 2 decades in federal prison, while his reputation remained permanently destroyed throughout the pharmaceutical industry. His attempts to rebuild his life thwarted by the comprehensive nature of his crimes and the thoroughness of my documentation. His former colleagues, friends, and family members learned the full scope of his deception through court records and news coverage, leaving him isolated and despised by everyone who had once respected him, while his financial obligations to Nexera Labs and other victims ensured that he would emerge from prison with nothing to show for his years of theft and fraud. As I looked toward my future, working in corporate security, building new relationships based on honesty and mutual respect, and finally understanding my own strength and intelligence, I realized that exposing Bradley's crimes hadn't just been about revenge or justice. It had been about reclaiming my own identity and discovering capabilities I never knew I possessed, proving that sometimes the most devastating response to betrayal is simply refusing to remain the person someone else tried to make you become.